In the waning days of the Civil War, when gunfire still echoed faintly across distant fields and weary soldiers limped home to broken farms, a small Virginia village found itself haunted by a mystery far darker than war itself. Among its simple folk lived a young wet nurse, entrusted with the most sacred of duties, to nourish and protect the child of a prominent household while its mother lay weak from illness. She was known for her quiet demeanor, her hands steady, her presence unassuming, the sort of woman whose devotion was measured not in words, but in the soft, steady care she gave. Yet one spring morning, before the rooster crowed and the bells tolled, she was gone. The cradle was found untouched, the infant stirring and crying in hunger, and the woman whose life revolved around that child had simply vanished into the night. At first the explanation seemed unfathomable. No trace of struggle was seen in her quarters, no footprints in the mud outside, no farewell scribbled on scraps of paper. It was as though she had dissolved into air, leaving behind only questions that the community was not prepared to face. For in a time when women were often judged less by their character than by the suspicions of others, her silence became its own indictment. Some said she fled out of shame, carrying with her a secret too dangerous to reveal. Others whispered she had been punished by forces beyond human comprehension, her body taken by spirits who would not allow her to speak of what she had seen. In the taverns, the stories grew sharper. Farmers swore she had been spotted on the edge of the woods, walking barefoot with her hair unbound, muttering to shadows that moved against the moonlight. Mothers warned their children not to wander, for the wet nurse's ghost was said to stalk the hedgerows, searching for an infant she abandoned and could never reclaim. And yet, others defended her, claiming she had been nothing but loyal, and that to accuse her was to ignore the darker undercurrents of the household she served. Could it be that she had stumbled upon a secret, an act of cruelty, betrayal, or even murder that demanded her silence? The village itself was divided. Some clung to reason, insisting she must have met with violence at the hands of deserters or thieves prowling the countryside. Others turned to folklore, interpreting her disappearance as a curse, a judgment, a reminder that war had loosened not just the bonds of nation, but of faith and family as well. And somewhere between these extremes lay the truth, buried under layers of rumor, fear, and silence that time has refused to unravel. More than a century and a half later, her story remains a phantom in the historical record, barely acknowledged in official ledgers, yet vividly alive in the whispered tales of descendants. Was she victim or villain, a woman silenced by others, or one who chose silence as her final act? The vanished wet nurse left behind only questions, but her absence screamed with a guilt no one could name. The woman who came to be known only as the vanished wet nurse was, in truth, far more than the title history attached to her. She was born in the 1840s in the quiet hills of Western Virginia, a place where families lived from the soil, and children grew up under the weight of hard work before they ever learned the freedom of laughter. Her family was poor, her father a tenant farmer with land never truly his own, her mother a woman whose hands were cracked from laundry and spinning. Childhood was not a gentle season for her, but one of labor, obedience, and a hunger for survival. Even as a girl, she learned quickly that silence was safer than speaking, and duty was more precious than dreams. It was this silence, carried like a second skin, that the villagers would later twist into suspicion. By the time she reached womanhood, the Civil War had already consumed Virginia. Soldiers marched through fields, wagons rattled along roads heavy with supplies, and whispers of loyalty and treachery haunted every porch. For a woman of her station, choices were limited. Marriage was unlikely without a dowry. Farm work left little for her to call her own, and so she found herself taking on the work that others often dismissed yet relied upon desperately, the work of a wet nurse. Nursing another woman's child was not simply labor, it was an intimate bond, a contract of trust, and in some ways, a surrender of one's body to another household's survival. She accepted it because she needed bread, but also because it gave her a place in a world that often treated the poor as shadows. To the family that employed her, she was both indispensable and invisible. The mistress of the household, weakened from childbirth, depended upon her, while the master of the house often regarded her as little more than a servant. The child, of course, knew only warmth, the rhythm of her heartbeat, the nourishment of her care. In that nursery, she was more mother than stranger, more protector than guest. Yet even in this trusted role, she was never fully accepted. Some whispered that she prayed too long at night, that her lips murmured words not taught in church, that she kept to herself when the others laughed by the fire. She was kind to the children of the village, yet distant from their parents. When asked about her own past, she answered only in fragments, never the full tale. It was enough to keep people wondering, and wondering turned easily to doubt. Her solitude was not without reason. Poverty had shaped her into a woman cautious of gossip, aware of how quickly a reputation could be destroyed. She carried the memory of hunger, of nights when her siblings went without supper, and of the shame of wearing clothes patched so many times the fabric seemed more thread than cloth. This gave her a quiet strength, but also a guarded heart. In a community where women were expected to chatter, to trade stories at wells and markets, her silence became conspicuous. She was respected, yes, for her devotion to children, but beneath the respect there lingered unease. The war deepened this unease. With so many men gone to fight, the village was stripped of its protectors. Suspicion spread like fever, and people looked for scapegoats to explain misfortunes. Crops failed? Blame the neighbor. A cow went dry? Blame the woman with the strange eyes and the solitary habits. The wet nurse, with her nighttime prayers and her long silences, became an easy vessel for such fears. That she worked in a prominent household only sharpened the whispers. Perhaps she heard things she should not. Perhaps she carried secrets too heavy to share. And yet, there were others who saw in her nothing but goodness. Families remembered how she would cradle fussy infants at community gatherings, how she calmed them with a hum low and steady, how her hands never faltered when a child was sick. She had a way of looking at children as though they were not burdens but miracles. Those who saw this side of her argued fiercely that she was misunderstood, that the harshness of poverty had made her cautious, but not cruel. Still, admiration could not erase the darker murmurs, and the balance between reverence and suspicion followed her like a shadow. In private, she was a woman divided. Her nights were often spent in prayer, but her prayers were not always gentle. She whispered of strength, of endurance, of enemies brought low. Some who overheard her claimed the words sounded like curses. Others believed they were cries of exhaustion from a woman who carried too much on her shoulders. In truth, she was both, nurturer and fighter, servant and survivor. Poverty had hardened her, but devotion softened her edges. She could hold an infant with infinite patience one moment and slam a door in anger the next. To those who observed only fragments of her life, she seemed a contradiction, and contradiction in those days was dangerous. Her employment bound her to a household torn by the war's politics. The master of the house had ties to Confederate sympathizers, while distant cousins leaned toward the Union. Dinner conversations were hushed, arguments cut short when servants entered the room. The wet nurse, moving quietly with the child in her arms, absorbed more than she revealed. Did she know secrets? Almost certainly. Did she ever use them? No one could say. What is certain is that her position gave her access to conversations others would have killed to silence. That fact alone was enough to make her a figure of unease. The community's testimony about her remains divided even now in the scraps of letters and oral accounts that survived. One woman wrote that she was as patient as the Lord himself, with a calmness that soothed all in her care. Another recalled her as a woman whose eyes held storms, who never forgave a slight. The contrast paints a picture of a woman both admired and feared, both protector and possible manipulator. She became in memory a mirror for the fears and hopes of those around her. Her life was not simply that of a servant, but a testament to resilience in an unforgiving era. She navigated the dangerous currents of class, of war, of gender expectations. She learned to smile when praised, to bow when dismissed, to endure when overlooked. Yet beneath that endurance lay a suppressed rage, born not from cruelty, but from years of knowing her worth would never be fully recognized. That rage may never have burst forth in action, but it simmered, unspoken, in the silences that made others uneasy. And so, when she vanished, people looked back on her life through the prism of their fears and judgments. To some, her disappearance proved her innocence, that she was a victim taken too soon, silenced by violence or circumstance. To others, it confirmed their darkest suspicions, that she had fled because her own guilt was too heavy to bear. The truth of her life, however, was far more complex. She was neither saint nor villain, but a woman shaped by hunger, bound by duty, softened by care, and sharpened by injustice. Her life was ordinary in its struggles and extraordinary in its endurance. It is perhaps this very complexity that has kept her story alive. She embodied the contradictions of her time: poverty and resilience, tenderness and anger, devotion and suspicion. She was, in every sense, human. And yet in her silence, in the absence she left behind, she became something more: a symbol, a ghost, a reminder of how society judges women, not by what they do, but by what others fear they might have done. Her life did not end in legend. It was lived day by day in hunger and labor, in whispered prayers and weary nights. And yet because she vanished, because she left behind questions without answers, that ordinary life became myth. She became a figure of speculation, of folklore, of warning tales told to children by firelight. The wet nurse's life, remembered in fragments, continues to stir debate not because of what she did, but because of what she represented, a woman whose silence could never be safely interpreted, and whose very existence challenged the boundaries between loyalty and suspicion, innocence and guilt. The night began like so many others in that small Virginia village, with the quiet descent of dusk and the weight of war pressing heavily upon the air. Families shuttered windows against the chill, lamps glowed faintly behind curtains, and the hush of an unsettled peace fell across the fields. Yet within the home where the wet nurse served, silence was broken by the thin, plaintive cries of the infant entrusted to her care. The baby's wail carried down the hallway, an urgent call for comfort, but no answering footsteps came. The mother, weakened by childbirth, lay restless in her chamber, waiting for the familiar sound of the wet nurse moving to soothe the child. Instead, the cries only grew louder, echoing through the wooden rafters until they seemed to stir the very walls. It was the first sign that something was terribly wrong. On the dining table, a half-prepared meal remained untouched. Bread sat uncut, a bowl of stew cooled beside a spoon that had been hastily set down. A cup of milk, half drained, lingered as if abandoned mid-sip. Chairs stood slightly askew, one pulled back as though its occupant had risen suddenly, called away by some unseen urgency. To those who later entered the room, it looked as though life itself had been interrupted, frozen in a moment between calm routine and sudden departure. The hearth fire burned low, casting long shadows across the walls, shadows that made ordinary objects seem strangely menacing. By the doorway, a shawl was discovered, its fabric thin and frayed, but unmistakably hers. She had been known to clutch it tightly during the evening hours, wrapping it around her shoulders as she moved through the drafty halls. To find it discarded at the threshold was unsettling, as though she had either left in haste or had been pulled from the house before she could retrieve it. The shawl was more than cloth. It was her armor against the cold, her companion in solitude. Its abandonment raised more questions than answers. Neighbors later testified that they had seen her that night near the edge of the woods. One woman, carrying water from her well, swore she caught sight of the wet nurse's familiar silhouette moving swiftly through the trees. Another insisted that she was not alone, that a second figure lingered just behind her, too indistinct to identify yet unmistakably present. In the flicker of lantern light, it might have been shadow, it might have been illusion. But the insistence with which these testimonies were delivered gave them weight. Who was the figure? A stranger passing through the village, a soldier deserter hiding in the woods, or someone from within the community itself? Dogs howled that evening, their cries rising suddenly into the night as though stirred by something unseen. The villagers remembered the sound with unease, describing it as unnatural, prolonged, almost mournful. Some said the animals sensed danger, that their howls were warnings ignored. Others believed the dogs were howling at a presence not of this world, a specter or curse walking among them. The coincidence was enough to lodge itself into the collective memory, transforming ordinary canine cries into an omen that still haunts retellings of that night. Inside the home, a single lamp flickered on the bedside table near the infant's crib. Its flame wavered wildly, casting erratic light across the crying child's face. Later, the mistress of the house described waking briefly to see the lamp glow strangely, almost as if the room itself were breathing with unease. When she rose the next morning, the lamp was cold, the wick burned low, its light extinguished along with the presence of the woman they relied upon most. That extinguished lamp became a symbol of the mystery, a fragile flame snuffed out too soon. When dawn came, the town awoke to whispers spreading faster than the morning fog. The wet nurse's bed was found empty, its covers neatly turned as though she had prepared to sleep but never returned. The infant, exhausted from crying, finally drifted into shallow rest, yet its cheeks bore the redness of a night spent in neglect. The mother, upon realizing the absence, sent servants scurrying in every direction. By mid-morning, the village was alive with speculation, doorways crowded with neighbors exchanging theories, every small detail magnified into potential evidence. Some leaned toward rational explanations. Perhaps she had fled. She was poor after all, bound to a family not her own, living a life of service with little reward. The chaos of war made escape plausible. Women vanished during those years, seeking safer havens. or reuniting with family long separated by shifting battle lines. To those who believe this, her departure was a desperate act of self-preservation, a bid for freedom made in the dead of night. Others suggested abduction. Bands of deserters roamed the countryside, men hardened by loss and hunger. A solitary woman moving toward the woods would have been an easy target. Her shawl at the doorstep might have slipped during a struggle. The untouched food abandoned when she was snatched away. The howling dogs, the second figure in the trees, all aligned with the notion that she had been taken, her fate sealed by forces beyond her control. But the more sinister theories could not be silenced. Some whispered that she'd been seen making strange gestures near the fire in evenings past, that her prayers sounded like incantations, that her solitude masked dark alliances. To them, her disappearance was not flight or abduction but pact, an unholy bargain that claimed her in exchange for power or vengeance. The howling dogs, the flickering lamp, the cries of the child, each became evidence not of crime but of curse. To believe this was to see her vanishing not as tragedy, but as punishment. The contradictions only deepened as more voices joined the discussion. A farmhand reported finding footprints near the woods, small and bare, leading inward but never returning. Another villager claimed he heard soft singing carried on the night air, a lullaby that chilled his blood. The sheriff, skeptical of superstition, dismissed such claims as hysteria. Yet even he could not explain why the prints ended abruptly in a patch of undisturbed earth, as though swallowed whole by the forest itself. Rumors painted the night in shifting colors, a hurried escape, a violent struggle, a spectral visitation. Thievery fabric of the community seemed to unravel as families debated. Suspicion blossomed, and the infant's wails echoed like a reminder of absence that could not be ignored. Rational thought collided with superstition, until the line between them blurred beyond recognition. Years later, the retellings of that night retained the same details: the untouched meal, the shawl at the doorstep, the cries of the infant, the howling of the dogs, but each telling added its own embellishments. Some insisted she had been seen at midnight standing in the churchyard, her hands raised as if in prayer or defiance. Others swore her shadow lingered at the edge of their windows, vanishing when confronted. Her disappearance became less an event and more a legend, interpreted and reinterpreted until fact and folklore fused. Yet truth remains clear. The night of her vanishing was not ordinary. It was a rupture in the pattern of life, a moment when silence screamed louder than any confession. Whether she was victim or conspirator, fugitive or sacrifice, the void she left behind transformed a small village into a place forever haunted by uncertainty. And in that uncertainty lies the enduring power of her story, the unanswered question of why she walked into the night and whether she walked alone. The morning after her disappearance, the search began not with organized procedure but with the frantic steps of neighbors and the heavy silence of a family undone. The mistress of the house, pale and trembling, demanded answers. The infant's cries had become weaker, exhausted after a night of neglect, and that sound seemed to echo through the halls like a rebuke. Servants whispered of omens, while others hurried to summon the sheriff. By noon the yard was crowded with townsfolk, their curiosity disguised as concern, their murmurs laced with suspicion. Everyone wanted to know what had happened to the wet nurse who had vanished into the dark. The sheriff arrived, his coat still damp with morning dew, his face worn by years of conflict and civil unrest. He moved with deliberate steps, carrying with him both the authority of law and the limitations of his time. The war had left resources scarce, crime high, and order fragile. He began by questioning the family, pressing for details of her final hours. The mistress recounted the uneaten food, the shawl left behind, the infant's cries. Her words were sharp, edged with something that sounded less like grief and more like resentment. The wet nurse had always been both a necessity and a burden, bound to the household by circumstance rather than affection. That tension colored every word of testimony. Neighbors offered their recollections with varying certainty. One spoke of seeing her near the woods, her figure silhouetted against lantern light. Another swore she was being followed. A third denied seeing her at all. The contradictions frustrated the sheriff, who scribbled notes into a leather-bound ledger, each statement adding confusion rather than clarity. He pressed harder, but every answer only deepened the mystery. The lines between memory and rumor blurred quickly, leaving him to navigate a maze of half-truths and embellishments. It was the discovery of footprints that gave the investigation its first tangible lead. Along the edge of the property, pressed into the damp earth, were impressions unmistakably human. They were bare, small, and fragile, unmistakably belonging to a woman. The trail led toward the woods, weaving slightly as if her steps had faltered. Then abruptly they ended in a patch of mud that should have preserved them further. Instead, the prints simply ceased. Beyond that point, the ground was undisturbed. No drag marks, no scuffle, no indication of where she had gone. The sheriff crouched low, tracing the final outline with his hand, his brow furrowed. To the rational mind, perhaps she had been lifted, carried away by force. To others, it was evidence of something unnatural, as if she had been swallowed by the night itself. The clergy soon became involved, summoned by whispers that the disappearance bore the mark of sin. A local pastor arrived, Bible in hand, and after touring the home, he found his attention fixed upon the object left on her bedside table. It was a Bible, open not to a random page but to passages that spoke of betrayal and judgment. Words about Judas and the price of blood stared up from the yellowed paper, and those who saw it felt a chill settle over them. Had she been reading it in despair, questioning loyalty and guilt? Or had someone placed it there deliberately, a silent message or condemnation? The pastor insisted it was a sign, that her soul was troubled, that she had either fled into madness or been claimed as punishment. Yet the sheriff remained unconvinced. He sought explanations grounded in human behavior, examining her debts and conflicts. Records showed that she owed money to shopkeepers, that her wages were stretched thin, that she had been accused quietly of taking more than her share of food from the pantry. Rumors surfaced of arguments with the mistress, of raised voices behind closed doors, of resentment simmering beneath duty. One servant claimed she had overheard the wet nurse threatening to leave if conditions did not improve. Another said she had seen her clutching coins late at night, coins that did not belong to her. These testimonies painted her as desperate, perhaps reckless, capable of flight or worse, but not all voices condemned her. Some remembered her devotion, her endless patience with the infant, the gentleness with which she rocked the child to sleep. They described her not as thief or traitor, but as victim, a woman trapped by poverty, her spirit worn thin by labor and isolation. These contradictions tore at the investigation, pulling it between narratives of guilt and innocence, loyalty and betrayal. Each witness seemed to project their own fears and prejudices onto her absence, shaping her story to fit their worldview. The science of the time offered little clarity. Physicians were called to examine the evidence, but their tools were limited to observation and conjecture. One suggested she had succumbed to exhaustion, her mind breaking under the weight of responsibility. Another posited madness, a condition too easily blamed upon women in those years. Neither explanation satisfied the sheriff, who found it hard to accept that a woman could simply dissolve into the night without leaving a trace. Still, the medical men persisted, their theories cloaked in authority, though built upon fragile foundations. Meanwhile, folklore began to wrap itself around the case like ivy. The villagers whispered that she had been taken, seized not by man but by forces beyond comprehension. Some spoke of witches who wandered the woods, of debts owed to darker powers, of spirits eager to claim the disloyal. The howling dogs of that night, the flickering lamp, the abandoned shawl, all were reinterpreted through the lens of superstition, becoming signs of an unholy presence. The pastor, though wary of fueling hysteria, did not entirely dismiss these fears. He spoke of divine justice, of sinners swallowed whole, of communities tested by the mysteries of God's will. This clash, between the sheriff's rational pursuit of evidence and the clergy's insistence upon moral judgment, defined the investigation. Each step forward led to one argument, each discovery interpreted through opposing lenses. The footprints that ended abruptly, to the sheriff, a Signoff abduction, to the pastor, proof of vanishing wrought by sin. The open Bible, to one, a clue of inner turmoil. To the other, a warning written by fate itself. The villagers found themselves caught between these forces, uncertain which authority to believe, their own fears shaping their allegiances. Weeks passed and still no body was found, no confession made, no resolution achieved. The sheriff scoured the woods, organized searches, questioned strangers passing through town, but the trail remained cold. The pastor led prayers warning his flock to guard their souls lest they invite the same fate. Families locked doors at night, and children were told not to wander past the edge of fields. What began as a disappearance grew into a shadow that stretched over the entire village, altering its rhythms, embedding unease into its very soil. Letters from that time capture the tension vividly. One townsman wrote of the smell of iron and lightning that lingered in the house long after she had gone, a scent he could not explain. Another recorded the silence of the woods during search parties, as if nature itself withheld answers. Diaries of the family spoke of grief mingled with shame, of neighbors' eyes that seemed to accuse as much as they pitied. The wet nurse's absence became not just her mystery but the town's burden, a mirror reflecting its divisions and fears. By the time winter set in, the investigation had lost momentum. The sheriff had exhausted his leads. The clergy had exhausted their sermons. Officially, the case was left unresolved, filed away as a disappearance beyond explanation. But unofficially, it lived on in whispers, in fireside tellings, in the unease that clung to every creak of the floorboards in her former room. Theories multiplied with each retelling, but answers never came. What remained was a rift between reason and superstition, law and faith, guilt and innocence. The footprints that ended in nothing, the Bible that spoke of betrayal, the debts and arguments, the rumors of theft. All these fragments formed a puzzle that refused to resolve. The investigation, meant to bring clarity, only deepened the uncertainty. In the end, it was not justice or revelation that the community found, but a haunting reminder that some mysteries defy explanation, that silence can scream louder than any confession, and that absence can wound more deeply than death. The testimonies began in whispers, quiet confessions shared only between neighbors or murmured inside dimly lit kitchens, where the crackle of fire offered comfort against the chill of memory. But as the years passed, those whispers hardened into stories that would bind the little Virginia village into a web of remembrance, grief, and lingering fear. The vanished wet nurse, once flesh and bone, had become something else, an echo, a shadow, a presence that refused to leave. The first testimony came only weeks after her disappearance. A young farmhand returning late from the fields swore he heard a lullaby drifting across the meadow. It was the same soft tune the wet nurse had often sung to the infant, a melody as gentle as a rocking cradle. Yet the farmhouse was dark, the windows shuttered, and the family fast asleep. The boy insisted he saw no figure, only the wavering glow of a lantern that vanished when he approached. The townsfolk dismissed it as fatigue, the trick of a weary mind, but the boy's trembling voice convinced others he had heard something real. Months later, a different account surfaced. A midwife claimed she saw the woman's silhouette near the churchyard, bent as if cradling an infant. The night was moonlit, the graves silver with dew, and the figure moved slowly between the stones before fading into mist. When the midwife told her story, some villagers scoffed, yet her reputation for honesty carried weight. She insisted she had not been dreaming, nor drunk, but fully awake and sober. And what unsettled her most was not the sight of the figure, but the sound. A baby's faint whimper carried on the wind. Other testimonies layered themselves onto the growing legend. Farmers spoke of hearing footsteps along the dirt roads after midnight, too light to be a man's, too steady to be an animal's. Children whispered of seeing a shawl flapping in the branches of the trees, though no wind stirred the leaves. Even within the courthouse, people claimed to hear faint sobs during sessions, as though the walls themselves remembered her absence. The rational dismissed it all, yet the stories multiplied, taking on the gravity of shared truth. One of the most chilling testimonies came from the mistress of the household, where the wet nurse had served. She confessed years later, on her deathbed, that she awoke one night to the sound of the baby crying. When she entered the nursery, she saw not her own child but the wet nurse herself, rocking the infant in the chair. Her figure was pale, translucent, and when the mistress gasped, the apparition turned its face toward her. The eyes, she claimed, were hollow, and the smile stretched too wide to belong to the woman she had once known. The apparition vanished with the infant's cry, leaving the child sleeping peacefully in the cradle. The mistress never spoke of it while she lived, fearing ridicule, but her confession spread swiftly after her passing. Such accounts blurred the line between grief and superstition. For some, they were evidence of a restless spirit, a woman unable to find peace after betrayal or abandonment. For others, they were the hallucinations of a community wounded by loss, clinging to specters because truth had failed them. Psychologists much later would argue that collective trauma can manifest in visions, that guilt and sorrow feed the imagination until shadows take on shape and voice. But in the village, those explanations rang hollow. Too many had seen, too many had heard. Children grew up with the wet nurse as a figure in cautionary tales. They were warned not to wander at night, lest they hear her song and follow it into the woods, never to return. Parents whispered of her presence in the fields, watching over infants with a tenderness that seemed both protective and vengeful. Young girls, especially, were told to pray before sleep, lest the ghostly nurse mistake them for the baby she had left behind. In this way, memory turned into folklore, and folklore hardened into fear. Years later, the courthouse records mentioned strange disturbances. Clerks noted candles extinguishing without cause, inkwells overturning and documents vanishing only to reappear in odd places. Though no official report blamed the supernatural, rumors spread that the wet nurse lingered in those halls, demanding her story be remembered. One clerk, skeptical of ghosts, admitted privately that he heard humming on more than one occasion when he worked alone. The sound, he said, was unmistakable, a lullaby. The most unsettling testimony came decades after the disappearance, from the child she had once cared for. Grown into adulthood, he recalled nights when he woke to the faint sensation of being rocked, though no one was there. He described dreams of a woman's face bending over him, not his mother's but the wet nurse's, her lips moving in silent prayer. Sometimes he awoke to find his blanket tucked more tightly than when he had fallen asleep. He confessed hell of it his entire life with the conviction that she had never truly left him, that she had hovered unseen, guarding or haunting, he could not decide which. The blending of testimony and haunting raised questions no investigator could solve. Were these stories born of memory and fear, or had the woman's silence become a voice that spoke from beyond? The people of the village could not agree, but they could not dismiss her either. Every account, every sighting, every lullaby in the night carried with it the same unspoken belief, that guilt and injustice leave echoes, and those echoes cannot be silenced by time. To this day, the fields and woods of that Virginia village are said to hold her presence. Travelers speak of hearing a baby's cry in the distance, only to find no child near. The old farmhouse, long abandoned, is rumored to glow with candlelight at odd hours. Even skeptics admit the air feels heavier there, as though burdened by memory. And always at the center of it all stands the figure of the vanished wet nurse, her silence louder than any scream, her absence more haunting than any ghost. The disappearance of the wet nurse was never officially solved, and perhaps that is why theories blossomed like weeds in the silence she left behind. Some were born of logic, others of grief, and still others from the shadows where folklore and superstition thrive. Over the decades, the explanations became as much a part of the story as the disappearance itself, each one offering a fragment of possibility, but never the whole truth. Together they created a prism of mystery, refracting her absence into countless meanings. One of the earliest and most enduring theories was the simplest, that she fled. The war had left Virginia scarred, families fractured, and futures uncertain. Some believed the wet nurse saw an opportunity to escape the confines of servitude. By vanishing, she could free herself from poverty, and reinvention might be possible in another town where no one knew her past. Supporters of this theory pointed to her shawl at the doorstep and the untouched meal on the table. Both could suggest haste, a woman leaving before she changed her mind. But if she fled willingly, why abandon the infant she had sworn to protect? Her devotion to children was one of the few traits universally agreed upon by all who had known her. To forsake the baby without farewell clashed with every story told of her care. And so the theory of escape, while tempting in its simplicity, remained unsatisfying, leaving questions as heavy as those it answered. A darker possibility soon arose: murder. In this version, the wet nurse did not leave of her own will but was silenced because she knew too much. Village records hinted at tensions within the household she served. Rumors circulated of debts unpaid, quarrels with the mistress, and hints of theft or betrayal. Some whispered she had discovered secrets, perhaps an affair, perhaps a hidden pact made in the chaos of war. Her silence, then, was not chosen but forced. Supporters of this view pointed to the abrupt end of her footprints in the mud, as though she had been lifted or dragged away. They spoke of the Bible left open to passages of betrayal, as if someone had staged the scene with cruel intent. Yet no body was found, and without one, murder lived only in whispers, never in the certainty of evidence. Others reached for explanations beyond crime or choice. The Civil War had left the land soaked with blood and sorrow, and many believed the spirits of the war dead lingered, hungry for the living. According to local folklore, the wet nurse was taken by those spirits. They called her disappearance a punishment or perhaps an initiation, a soul claimed because she straddled two worlds, motherhood and servitude, devotion and resentment. Tales spread of phantom soldiers leading her into the woods, their uniforms tattered, their voices pleading for her care as if they were children themselves. In this version, she was not victim nor fugitive but chosen, swept into a realm beyond sight. Generations later, people still called her the Silent Mother, a figure said to appear whenever betrayal hid within a household. Her silence screamed the guilt of others, and her presence was taken as warning that secrets never remain buried. Psychologists who revisited the case centuries later offered a different lens. They argued that the wet nurse became a projection of communal guilt, Villagers, burdened by the horrors of war, by starvation, by suspicion, needed a vessel for their unspoken fears. The woman, already marked by solitude and whispered oddities, became that vessel. Her disappearance was real, but thesteries of hauntings, lullabies, and apparitions were the community's way of externalizing trauma. In this view, she was not a ghost but a mirror, reflecting the anxieties of people who had survived too much and could not articulate their grief. Historians, meanwhile, leaned on practical explanations. They noted that wet nurses often lived precarious lives, vulnerable to exploitation and suspicion. Perhaps she was accused unjustly of neglect or harm, and in shame or under threat she vanished. Or perhaps she succumbed to exhaustion, wandered into the woods, and met an end too quiet for discovery. The Civil War had left many graves unmarked. Perhaps hers was simply among them, swallowed by time. Yet even historians conceded that logic alone could not silence the depth of legend surrounding her. The village did not remember her as a statistic, but as a presence that refused erasure. Among the townsfolk, the supernatural always held more weight than scholarly analysis. Stories multiplied, each adding texture to the myth of the Silent Mother. Some said she appeared in households where wives suspected infidelity, her pale figure warning of betrayal. Others swore she haunted nurseries, rocking empty cradles, her lullabies both tender and unsettling. Farmers told of seeing her in fields at dusk, holding an invisible child, her lips moving in silent reproach. Her silence was never neutral. It demanded interpretation, demanded that those who witnessed her reckon with what they had hidden. In later generations, folklorists recorded the belief that she became a guardian spirit for neglected children. Families claimed that when infants fell sick, they sometimes heard humming near the crib, and the child would miraculously recover. Others told opposite tales, of children stricken after families mocked her story, as though she punished disbelief. In this way, she became both protector and avenger, embodying the contradictions of the woman she once was: kindness laced with solitude, loyalty shadowed by suspicion. The legend spread far beyond Virginia. By the early 20th century, ghost stories in neighboring states included references to a silent mother who watched over households in turmoil. Writers and preachers used her tale as parable, a warning against betrayal, a reminder of the voiceless whose labor sustained families yet was seldom honored. In these retellings, her silence was not emptiness but testimony, speaking truths the living dared not. Yet for all the theories, escape, murder, haunting, folklore, psychology, none resolved the puzzle. Each held fragments of plausibility, yet all left gaps. If she fled, why was there no trace? If she was murdered, why no evidence? If spirits took her, why did they leave behind only silence? If she was projection of guilt, why did the visions feel so tangible? The mystery remained, suspended between explanations, refusing resolution. Perhaps that is why her story endures. Theories try to pin her down, but legends allow her to remain what she always was: an absence that demands presence, a silence that insists on being heard. In the village where she lived, the fields still carry her name. Travelers still whisper of lullabies on the wind, and families still warn children not to stray after dark. The Silent Mother remains, not because anyone knows what truly happened, but because no theory can erase her. The unanswered questions keep her alive. Did she flee guilt after harming the child? Was she silenced for knowing too much? Or was she, as the villagers believed, claimed by forces larger than reason, spirits of war, betrayal, and grief? Each possibility holds its own power, but none completes the puzzle. That incompleteness is her legacy, the reason her silence still echoes through time. She is not solved. She is not forgotten. She remains forever, the silence that screamed guilt. The farmhouse where she once worked is no longer a place of shelter. Its timbers sag, its windows gape like hollow eyes, and ivy twists across the stone as though trying to reclaim the past. Yet the ruin is not empty. Villagers swear that on certain nights, a faint cry drifts from the crumbling walls. The sound of an infant's wail answered by a lullaby sung in a voice no living throat has carried for more than a century. Whether it is the wind, the creak of settling wood, or something less natural, none can say. The question of who she was remains unsettled. Was she a victim, crushed beneath the weight of poverty, suspicion, and war? Was she a villain, capable of betrayal darker than anyone dared put to paper? Or was she neither, but instead transformed by the fears of a community desperate to explain the unexplainable? Each theory casts her in a different light, yet none holds her completely. She remains a figure defined not by what was known, but by what was never discovered. Records of her existence are sparse, her name written only in fragments across fading ledgers. Official accounts end with silence, as though the world itself turned the page without finishing the story. But folklore does not forget so easily. In whispered tales around firesides, she lingers, not just as the woman who vanished, but as a warning, a symbol, a presence that refuses to fade. Generations who never knew her still lower their voices when speaking of her, as though she listens from the shadows. The farmhouse ruins serve as both grave and monument. Some approach with reverence, others with fear. Children dare each other to enter, only to emerge pale and trembling, insisting they felt watched, that they heard footsteps where no one walked. Families crossing the fields nearby speak of sudden chills, as though invisible fingers brushed their skin. These stories may be nothing more than the tricks of imagination, but together they keep her alive in memory, alive in the way legends never truly die. And so the silence remains, heavier than words, louder than truth. It demands interpretation, demands that each listener decide whether she vanished into freedom, into violence, or into something beyond the reach of human comprehension. Perhaps she escaped, leaving behind nothing but questions. Perhaps she was taken, claimed by death, by vengeance, or by spirits restless from the war. Or perhaps her silence itself was the final act of defiance, a refusal to give anyone the closure they craved. What is undeniable is this: her absence has never ended. It echoes in the ruined farmhouse, in the whispered lullabies, in the very soil of Virginia where history and myth entwine. The mystery resists resolution, and that resistance is its power. Was she victim? Was she villain? Or has she become something greater than both? The answer lies in the silence she left behind. A silence that still speaks, still unsettles, still refuses to be forgotten.